Okay, perfect. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar entitled Planning and Implementing Successful Collections Assessments. My name is Darlene Bielowski, and I am president of the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance. I'm also a contract museum registrar and a fine and decorative arts appraiser located here in Southwest New Hampshire. This afternoon, we have planned for you an exciting presentation that should benefit anyone who has not yet done a collections assessment, or is about to undertake the challenge, or has done them in the past and is looking for a refresher. But a little housekeeping first. Please be sure to have yourself on mute until you are ready to ask a question, which you can verbalize or you can put into the chat box. And there will also be time built in for questions between panelists and at the end as well. If you're new to joining the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, or the CCCA as we refer to it sometimes, it is a Vermont nonprofit that was formally established in 2019 by 13 professionals who come from the fields of archives work, conservation, and object-based collections management. Our mission is threefold: to be a resource for networking, professional development, and educational opportunities for our colleagues working in small museums, cultural centers, archives, libraries, and other repositories; to be a resource for volunteers in those same venues who may not have the professional background support; and thirdly, to be a resource for the general public who collects or has inherited heirlooms and is always looking for the best ways to take care of their things. Our website, which I will ask Rachel to drop into the chat box, has a lot of information about past and upcoming events, biographies of board members, and a membership directory. There's also a Get Involved tab where you'll find 2 categories of membership with details on criteria for eligibility, and 1 category for anyone who wishes to join us as a friend. Each application of the 2 membership levels are reviewed by the board and approved, and all contributions from our membership dues go to supporting the work that the CCCA does. Just a reminder that next Tuesday from 12 noon to 1 p.m., we'll be hosting right here on Zoom our Conversation with Colleagues. This event is generally a benefit for professional affiliate members, but the board decided when we started to offer virtual webinars that the CWC would be open to all who attended the related presentation. It's a time to network, to ask further questions of the speaker or speakers, or to ask questions about the CCCA. It's also a time for the speakers to add additional comments to what they had offered the previous week. So each of you is invited to join us next week, and that link will come to you with the link for the recording of today's presentation. So now on to introducing our esteemed panelists. First, we'll have Erica Donis, who leads collections management, assessment, curatorial, and exhibition projects for museums, archives, libraries, and historical societies. She has more than 20 years experience working with large and small collecting organizations as an employee and as a consultant. As special collections director at Champlain College, Erica is responsible for arrangement and description, preservation of analog and digital materials, primary source instructions, exhibitions, and management of the annual local history event. Her recent independent consulting projects include curating Rail City, a new permanent exhibition for the St. Albans Museum, collections assessments for Dogs Mountain and the Sheldon Museum, and a historic furnishings plan for the Marsh Billings Rockefeller National Historical Park, for which she was a co-author. Based in Burlington, Vermont, Erica is a graduate of the Winter Program in Early American Culture, which is now called the American Material Culture Program. Eileen Corcoran currently serves as Director of Service and Outreach at the Vermont Historical Society, working mainly with local historical societies and museums around the state. She has 20 years of experience working with and for museums and other cultural organizations, including the Vermont Museum and Gallery Alliance, Upstate New York History Alliance, and the National Museum of the Morgan Horse, as well as the National Museum of Natural History. She also serves as an independent consultant and contractor specializing in collections care and management. She earned her BA in anthropology at Ithaca College and her MA in anthropology with a concentration in museum training at the George Washington University. Eileen resides in Waltham, Vermont. And then we have Chessie Monks Kelly, who is the archivist curator at Historic Saranac Lake and the Saranac Lake Laboratory Museum. Saranac Laboratory Museum. She manages the museum's collections, plans public programming, coordinates social media outreach, and maintains historic Saranac Lake's 2 historic buildings, among many other things, as we are all so familiar doing. Chessie has a great love for local history and is passionate about making her community's history accessible to all. She has a master's degree in library and information science with a concentration in archives management. Prior to joining HSL staff in 2015, Chessie worked on contract projects for the National Park Service with History Associates. And now I have the pleasure of turning the floor over to Erica.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me get my screen share started here. All right, so thank you so much for joining us for planning and implementing successful collections assessments. You'll be hearing from myself first, and then of course, Eileen and Chessie, and we have some pauses built in after each one of our components of the presentation this afternoon for you to ask questions. And then of course, we'll be available for more questions at the end as well. So I have the pleasure of kicking us off by giving you an overview of our agenda and then providing an overview about the assessment process as well. So today's agenda, we'll be talking through kind of the theory and the practice of doing assessments, including the motivations for doing them, the types of assessments that organizations typically do, the process involved, and we'll also be sharing some potential funding sources for you all as well. So to kick us off, I'm going to start just by sketching out kind of an overview of the 2 different basic types of collections preservation assessments. The first one being the general assessment. So up on your screen, you'll see of the variety of topics that are typically addressed in a general assessment. Depending on the size of your collection and the size of your organization and the complexities therein, typically these assessments are completed by sometimes 1 person, but up to 3 people, depending on your needs and the sizes and quantities involved. So a typical general preservation assessment will cover everything from policies and procedures, taking a look at mission statements, collections policies, collection scopes, forms and deeds that you have on hand for managing your collection, such as a deed of gift, policies for adding items to the collection and removing them from the collection for accessioning and deaccessioning. And also looking at intellectual control. So how are you managing how are you managing at a high level how your collections are organized and keeping track of where they are? So intellectual control might involve looking at, do you have inventories? Do you have a method for cataloging? Do you assign numbers to different collections items or groups of collections? How are you providing access to content to the public as well? And then the next bullet point, collections assessments also will cover an overview of your storage facilities. So facilities, equipment, the containers that you're using, and the conservation materials that are in contact with your collection. So are those appropriate for the various types of collections that you have at your organizations? Same thing goes for exhibits, for items that are on display. What are the facilities like? What's the equipment like that you have? What kinds of materials are you using to display your collections? General preservation assessments will also provide an overview assessment of the environment that your collection is in. And that would include temperature, relative humidity, as well as things like lighting and pest management. General preservation assessments are also going to look at your staffing, whether you're an all volunteer organization or whether you do have some paid staff. What is the structure of who's responsible for the collections in terms of the day-to-day, as well as who's responsible for the oversight of them? And is that structure and the number of hours that folks put in directly dealing with collections sufficient for the types and quantities of materials that you have? A general preservation assessment will also typically touch on security. Are there areas where your security is doing really well, or are there areas for improvement in terms of access to storage rooms, for example, or the security of your collections files, your management tools regarding your collection? Assessors will also take a look at housekeeping. What are the methods and the equipment that you have on hand for cleaning, doing general cleaning in storage and exhibit areas? And what kinds of materials and equipment are you using to actually clean collections items? Are there cleaning methods that you're using that are appropriate for collections managers to use? And are there cleaning methods that perhaps should be something that would be tabled and done under the oversight of a conservator? And then last but certainly not least, budgeting. What budget do you have to devote to the preservation of your collection and the management of it as well? And are there certain chunks of money that are available for certain aspects? And is there room for improvement and suggestion there? All right, so that's kind of an overview of general preservation assessments. Moving on to more collection-specific assessments. So these are a little bit more customizable, but they tend to cover a specific media type or perhaps a specific collection. And they're going to cover things in a little bit more granular detail, although not necessarily at the item level. It just depends on what your goals are as an organization and what's possible with the amount of funding that you have available in terms of the amount of time that the assessor might be able to spend. So these could perhaps take place at, you could have someone come in and do an assessment of all of your textiles, for example. So they could be looking at a chunk of your collections. You could have someone come and just look at the box of glass plate negatives that you have on hand. And they could also go through one item by item as well. But typically these are not going to be a substitute for actual proposals for conservation treatment. So they're going to give you an overview of condition in all aspects, including storage, exhibits, environment, but they're not necessarily going to be as detailed as a specific conservation treatment proposal. Oftentimes, these collection-specific preservation assessments are completed as a follow-up to a general preservation assessment. So an assessor might suggest in a general assessment, it would be great if you could bring back a specialist to look just at your historic automobiles or your glass plate negatives or your digital media that you have. So typically these collection-specific preservation assessments are done by an assessor who has a specialty in the area in that specific collection or media type. All right, so backing up just a little bit, what's the point of doing a preservation assessment anyway? Well, there are many reasons why you might decide to do one. You might be looking for detailed guidance on a certain area. You might not have a lot of background training on how best to manage a specific media type or component of your collection. And the advice of an assessor might be welcome in that area. You might be looking for help just sorting through what, among all of the critical needs that you perceive, what are the top priorities? So an assessor can bring their outside perspective in and really help you figure out where to focus your time and your money, and do so in a way that helps you spend less time feeling overwhelmed and more time focusing in on what's actually what you can actually accomplish in the short term versus the long term. Speaking of that external expertise, it's great to have an assessor come in who's a neutral party to provide guidance, and oftentimes, for better or for worse, your board of trustees, your director, the folks who have higher administrative duties and leadership roles at your organizations might take their advice more than if it's you, the person who's with the boots on the ground, making the request. So maybe you do need the external expertise, and often you can be in a situation where you are feeding requests through to that assessor when you meet with them, and providing them with the guidance over what you perceive are the biggest successes and things that you need to work on at your organization. And the external assessor, by putting them in a report with that professional stamp of approval, can often make a little bit more headway in terms of advocacy work within your organization. Validation, it's often also great to have a professional assessor come in and tell you all the things that you're doing well. And a good assessor will do that. They won't just spend their entire report telling you where the gaps are. They will be recognizing your hard work as well. You can use your assessment report for leverage. Maybe it's for advocacy. Maybe it's leverage within your organization, swaying members of your board of trustees to get on board with a project that you have in mind. It could also be external leverage as well. Oftentimes these reports are really great evidence to submit with a proposal for funding. So if you're submitting a grant proposal, you can point to your assessor's report and say, my assessor noted that X project was a critical priority for my organization. So I have the stamp of approval from that external person to submit with my grant proposal. And then of course you can attach the entire report with your application as an attachment. And finally, the assessment will lay some really great groundwork, whether it's helping you sort through priorities, or helping you figure out what your next steps are, and building upon the work that you've already done to move to the next level. All right, so a little bit of an overview of the role of the assessor. So as I've mentioned before, the assessor will provide some content expertise. They're bringing experience that they have from their professional life, either in terms of looking at collections management and preservation generally, but also in terms of a specific content area if you need that assistance. They are going to treat whatever you tell them confidentially. So they are going to be very good and professional about handling what you tell them and what they observe on site, and prepare a report that, if you wish it to be, is very confidential and will remain within your organization. The assessor should definitely provide you with a lot of validation. They're going to, in their report, they should be celebrating the fact that you are on board with doing this assessment and the projects that you've accomplished so far. So having that document in hand will be great in terms of internal and external advocacy. They'll also be considering the context of your organization. Where are you coming from? What size budget do you have? Do you have folks who are working for your organization who have professional training, or are you an all volunteer organization? What is the size of your budget? So they'll be preparing a report that is appropriate and speaks to where you're at and what appropriate next steps are going to be for your collection and your organization. They're going to be documenting existing conditions. Often, those of us who are in the weeds working with collections every day don't have time to pick our heads up, take photographs, take stock of where we are. And that's another great reason to have an assessor come in. They should be taking photos as part of their work and also taking a lot of notes. And you can use their report as documentation to really preserve a record of where you are at this point in time with various parts of your collections preservation and management of a collection. They're going to be addressing organizational priorities that are coming from you. So they should be asking you what your top concerns are. They should be asking you where you want to see your collections preservation and management go in the next year, 5 years, 10 years. They should be asking you what is reasonable according to the bandwidth that you have and the budget that you're able to provide for work in this arena. They should be incorporating both low-hanging fruit, things that are relatively easy and cost-effective for you to accomplish based on where you are. And they may also be including some stretch goals to things to look forward to in the future, and providing a link between those low-hanging fruit and the stretch goals. So when I do assessments, for example, I often, identify short, medium, and long-term goals for each area thematically within the assessment work. I'm also going to be identifying things that are either low cost or no cost, things that can be done immediately that would have a high impact versus the things that the organization might want to work towards in the long term. That might require a little bit more of a reach, particularly in terms of resources. So maybe a long-term suggestion might be to hire a professionally trained staff person or to obtain a grant to be able to renovate a storage area and put in a dehumidifier. Finally, the assessor will serve as a resource for you. So there may be questions that come up during the assessment process. And certainly you should be able to feel free to reach out to that assessor and ask follow-up questions later. If you reread the report a few months later and have a question that arises. So what are the roles of the receiving organization? So the recipient is going to need to be ready to commit to the process of having the assessment. And that we'll go through that in a little bit more detail, what that might entail. But it's usually a multi-step process that typically will take a few weeks to a few months, depending on scheduling and also the source of funding that you might be looking at. The assessor might ask you to gather some data before they arrive for a site visit. So they might ask you to prepare some information on, for example, if you've been doing environmental readings, do you have information, do you have data on what the temperature and relative humidity is in certain storage areas, for example? Do you know the types and quantities of that are in your collection? So can you provide an estimate if you don't know exactly? How many books do you have? How many photographs do you have? How many garments are in your collection? You'll also need to think through ahead of time and articulate during the process what your priorities are and what your top concerns are as well. Again, if you feed those to the assessor, they should be incorporating them in the report and addressing them so that you can use that as ammunition going forward. You should also be thinking about what your achievements are. What do you want to have recognized in your report? You're going to want to be open to constructive feedback. A good assessor will make sure that they balance the validation of the work that you've already done with constructive feedback about what next steps might be and where the gaps are that they might perceive. And you're going to want to be committed to following through with the recommendations that the assessor provides. So there's no need to go through the time and the effort involved with preparing for and hosting the assessor if you're not in a place where you can start to move forward with some of those recommendations. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to move forward with everything all at once, but at least a few of those goals that are low-hanging fruit should be things that you're open to proceeding for. And you're going to want to feel like you can communicate with candor. Typically, an assessment is an opportunity to show the reality of what your storage areas look like, or what you still have to process. Maybe you have a big collections backlog of things that you haven't arranged and described or cataloged. And so it's perfectly fine to be honest about that. In fact, the assessor would prefer that you are candid about your current situation so they can prepare the best report possible. All right, so a little bit more about the process of a collections assessment. So this process would typically apply whether you are embarking on a general preservation assessment or a more specific one. So these are the basic steps involved in the process. So initial contact, the receiving organization typically is the one to reach out to a potential assessor. And we can talk more about how you might find some names of folks depending on what exactly you are looking for and where you are geographically located. But after that organization reaches out, makes the initial contact, and you've talked about the scope of work and arrived on an appropriate cost for that work, you want to sign a contract. You want to have a written understanding of that scope of work and the costs involved, and also the timing. Typically, an assessor will send out a questionnaire ahead of a site visit. So they will ask you some leading questions about all of the areas that they will be assessing, whether they are housekeeping or security, or intellectual control, or the state of storage or exhibit spaces. And that's where typically you'll want to be able to be prepared to supply some data. So the pre-visit questionnaire might ask questions about how many of a certain type of collection you have, what are the different media types that you have in your collection, what kinds of forms and guidelines and policies you have on hand. You want to supply those in advance typically to your assessor. So next comes the site visit, which is typically in person. And the duration of the site visit will vary depending on the scope of work. So if you are doing a general preservation assessment of a particularly large collection, it might be a full day or even more, depending, and the assessor will be able to provide some guidance on what the appropriate length of time is for that site visit. So typically during a site visit, you're walking the person through all of the different areas where collections are located on your property. And you're also sitting down and meeting with them. Typically, there is time to meet with the folks who are directly involved in the daily management of the collection, as well as the folks who have more general oversight over the management of the collection. So depending on your organization, that could be meeting with a curator or a collections manager, and then also perhaps a director or one or more trustees, depending on the structure of your organization and who has responsibility for what area. So the assessor will take lots of photos and notes, and then they'll go back and write up a report. And the length of the report will vary based on the scope of work, but it will typically involve sections for each of the topics covered in the assessment. And a good assessor will provide you the opportunity to take a quick look at the draft and make sure that they haven't made an inadvertent error. Something as basic as misspelling a collection name. If you have a specific donor, you need to make sure that they're acknowledged in a certain way, or that they have misunderstood some aspect of what you've mentioned about how your collections are managed on site, or when something in the past happened, for example. And after your review period has passed, then the assessor will prepare a final submission. These days, it's typically a PDF document that includes a narrative written section as well as photographs. All right, so we have come to our first opportunity for some questions. And so I invite you to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself. And I'll give you a couple minutes to ruminate before we move on to our second presenter, Eileen. All right, well, there will be other opportunities for questions as we proceed, both today and then again next week when we reconvene for our conversations with colleagues networking session as well. So now I'm going to pass the baton over to Eileen. But Eileen, I'm going to keep screen sharing for you and you can tell me when to advance the slides.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of doing assessments and my experience, as well as introducing a case study from historic Saranac Lake. So just to give you a tiny bit of background, I sort of began doing assessments as part of my work for the Upstate History Alliance, which included working for the Documentary Heritage Program in New York State, doing assessment site visits and such related to library and archival collections there. And then have done some as I've gone along in my life as an independent consultant, and then now through VHS, not so much doing larger assessments, but doing smaller site visits and other activities with local historical societies and museums around Vermont. Next slide. Thank you. So I just wanted to talk about it from a little bit from the standpoint first about being an assessor and sort of qualities I think are important for being an assessor. So any of you on here today who are either part of that or interested in doing that, maybe this will help. And I think also when you're trying to pick an assessor or work with somebody, what maybe some of the traits to look for in folks that you're working with. And my first quality is open-mindedness. I think you as an assessor might have an idea about how you want to structure your assessment or how you want things to go or what you want to tell people. But I think you really do need to be prepared to adjust for what will work for the organization. So the assessment is not about you as an assessor, it's about the organization and what they need. And so really paying attention to their goals and what they want to get out of this, I think is essential. And again, if you're the organization getting an assessment, really be, as Erica mentioned, open about your goals, about what you want to accomplish, and be willing to share those and keep those front of mind for everybody. I also put down here sort of practice being non-judgmental and having a poker face. A lot of organizations, especially when they're working with an assessor, they may feel defensive, they may feel unworthy. I get a lot of, oh my God, this is the worst. It's not the worst. You're never the worst. If you think you're the worst, you're not the worst. And so I think, again, especially as an assessor, just we're not here to make judgments. We all have issues. Do not worry about it. But sort of work on that open-mindedness open-mindedness and sort of knowing that that's sort of one of those things that you're always going to encounter. Following up on that, I think having a realistic viewpoint, and that includes being realistic about the recommendations that you give. And again, this is why some of the prep work, the goals, and the aspects of what you're going to ask or tell this organization that they should or shouldn't do. I think, again, what I like to say is you want to share the ideal and plan for the real. So it's great for everybody to have an awareness of sort of what are our collections, care, and preservation ideals that we can strive towards, but understand that none of us are ever practically going to get there. And so how do we put those ideals into realistic viewpoints and realistic recommendations? Patience, and as I talk a little bit about the case study with historic Saranac Lake, you'll kind of understand where this comes in. It could take real time to make any progress. And I think, again, both from the assessor standpoint and from an organizational standpoint, it's not, you get the report and 2 months later, everything is done and hunky-dory and amazing and wonderful. So it takes patience. It can take patience to get the funding in the first place. It could take patience to get all the information you need. It could take patience to get the report from the assessor sometimes, depending on how many there are or what the process is into it. So I think, again, looking at your preservation assessment as this is a long-term activity. And so if we all have patience about the process, I think that's really important to have. And I think lastly, especially as an assessor, but also can go for an organization, don't take it personally. So the recommendations that you are giving, if somebody doesn't take it or doesn't do it or pushes back to it, that's, don't take that personally. At the same time, if an assessor is giving you a recommendation or saying something about your organization or the collections, care, and preservation that you currently have, that is what may be considered, in need of assistance, don't take it personally. Again, this is something where we all are trying to grow, and the end goals of improving the care and preservation of our collections is really what's the most important. And I think, again, in the long run too, if an organization can't or never does take any of your recommendations and make them happen, we talk sort of the pictures, kind of the report on the Bible on the shelf kind of idea. I think, again, for both sides, don't take it personally if something doesn't happen, because there are so many things that get in the way of that happening. So I'm going to talk next slide, please. Thank you. About this sort of in context of a preservation assessment I did at historic Saranac Lake. So historic Saranac Lake is located in Saranac Lake, New York. I will let Chezzy talk a little bit about the organization itself. But my work with them began in 2010 with an inquiry from their director, Amy Catania, who was referred to me by someone I'd worked with in New York State through the DHP program. So again, as Eric was talking about, how do you figure out how to get your assessor? Again, referrals are a really great way to find somebody. And so next slide. And so what they were looking for to start with was a preservation assessment funded by the PAG program. And Erica will talk a little bit about funders later, but PAG is Preservation Assistance Grants. They are out of NEH. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of what we did with this PAG grant. But again, we sort of talking with Amy put together the grant to work on a few things. And this is one of the things that PAG grants can let you do. So some programs are really literally just about assessments, and some programs or funding allows you to do assessments and then maybe sort of the next steps a little bit about assessments. And so that's what we ended up putting together for this. So it included a general preservation assessment, helping to draft a long-range plan for the care of their collection, providing on-site training to staff in methods and materials for the storage of collections, best practices for cataloging, and proper methods for arrangement and description, which we actually ended up turning into an inventory instead, based on the level of their need once we did the assessment. And then providing recommendations for initial supplies for collections care. And so again, I've got a few in the slides sort of before and after photos, which is always, again, the wonderful thing about this project is the ability to have some after photos. But again, here's one of the storage areas in historic Saranac Lake when we started this process. I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so again, another few of the display cases as they were in 2011. So again, contact in 2010, did the assessment to start with in 2011. And again, during that time and into 2012, we did some additional sort of consultation on things like the collections management policy, revisions and forms and procedures. So again, recommendations that were made in the general assessment and then continuing to help them as they implemented some of those initial recommendations as we go along. I think next slide. And so again, this continued my work with them into sort of once again in 2017 with an IMLS grant. And the grant at that time was related to sort of doing an update of the 2011 preservation assessment. So sort of the before and after aspect of where had they gone from 2011 to 2017. And then also this is where Chezi comes into play. And I'm sure we'll talk about all the wonderful things going on sort of since then, but sort of moving into more of a consultant role with reviewing documents, answering some specific questions and providing insight as needed as we go along. So again, this is another, this is an after photo of some of their collection storage, which I think again is anybody who knows collection storage, it's a beautiful thing to see. I think next slide, I think I have one more. Yeah, so another before and after. I was like this one on the left hand side. Chezi can tell you a little bit more about what collections they have, but it goes from like the bedpan on the box to all the beautifully labeled boxes on that. And so I think again, some of the ways in which for me working with historic Saranac Lake, and especially at the beginning in the 2011 assessment was great. They were sort of at a really good time to do this. So as an organization, they were starting, they'd hired some new professional staff, were working, going from their sort of initial foundation and founder to being a more professional and established organization. And so this is really sort of a center time for them to really start working on this and having people that could help lead it into the next step. They had a good group of volunteers even for folks at staffed organizations or less than minimally staffed organizations. You also still need your volunteers to help with collections projects, especially large projects potentially. So that was a really great thing for them as well. And not an overwhelming collection, again, because they were a relatively youngish organization. They didn't have
what is it that you need to do?
much to do. And again, I think another thing to be aware of when you're doing assessments and making recommendations are some of what I would call unfixable issues. So we as organizations have things that we can't necessarily fix no matter how much we want to. So for example, and I don't think I'm telling too many tales for Saranac Lake, they have shared spaces. So they have tenants in the building and have public programs that have gone on in the building, which obviously represents an issue related to security for collections. So that's one of those push-pulls to deal with. Another thing is sort of non-existent paperwork. I think that's another big one that a lot of places have. Again, we can't go back and create magic deeds of gifts that don't exist for things. So how do you can't fix it, so how do you work around those sorts of things? And understanding that is part of the recommendations that we make. And so I think, again, what's really been great for me about working with Historic Saranac Lake is that they have really done the work in making things happen. So again, you can, between the before and after, they have done a lot. And they have really, it's been really wonderful to have that relationship and to see it moving forward and sort of being a little bit of the part of the process of the places that they have been and are going even further than one would have thought based on the initial assessment. Again, I think that they have been successful because they were started at a good place. They were able to follow up with further funding and staffing. So again, adding Chezzy in to that mix, really allowed them to go to a next step going along and continuing to have an open dialogue. And again, that I was, it's not necessarily something you will get every time with an assessor, depending on, again, where they come from and what they're doing. But I know for myself, I like to help as much as I can, and being able to answer and sort of follow up on those questions related to recommendations is a great thing to have. And I will just say, obviously, that this is never done. So it's been 13 years since we started with, talking about this. And again, a lot of great work has been done. But, I did a little email archaeology on all of this. There's still some things that may never get done. Or again, priorities have changed over those 13 years as well. And so I think, again, this is something where don't ever think that you are not successful if you don't get recommendations done in a 6 months or a year, or even 2 years, but also to understand that this is an ongoing process. I think that was my last slide. Okay, questions? Okay.
Have you worked with a number of organizations let me rephrase the question. Have you worked with organizations that don't yet have a curator or a collections manager on staff, maybe have part-time volunteer curator?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, specifically for myself, a lot of the work that I've done and do now is with small organizations, so all volunteer, or maybe there's a half-time staff person and maybe they're related to collections care. So I think, again, doing a general preservation assessment as a super small organization is possible. I think, again, it can be very useful. I think, again, this is where the back and forth, where you have to have that conversation with your assessor about, we aren't able to do X, Y, and Z unless we build capacity. That might not be something that can be done. And how do we create recommendations and goals that can be done, and can be done by organizations that have little to no professional staff? And there is stuff that can be done. I think, again, I think no matter what, that sort of core group of people who are volunteers or a little bit of staff is necessary to get things done. Okay. All right. Well, again, feel free, any others in the chat, or we'll have some time after, and I'm going to turn it over to Chezzy.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Chessie, as you've heard many times, and I am the archivist and curator here at Historic Saranac Lake. We are an organization that's housed in the first laboratory for studying tuberculosis in the United States. So our collection primarily focuses on that, but there was also a huge tuberculosis industry here in town for more than 70 years. And that has really influenced how our community has grown. So it's a weird collection, basically. I was not here when Eileen did the assessment. So I inherited both the assessment and the relationship with Eileen, which is great. I was sort of coming in blind. I was glad to have the assessment as I started to get my feet under me. I actually originally started as the public programs coordinator just because we had gotten a grant to pay for that position. But I have a background in archives and collections management. So I as I said, inherited the collection, inherited as it was, and what had happened in the intervening years was a major inventory project where basically they put everything they could find in the museum. Some of it had been here before, some of it had shown up on our doorstep, some of it had, Lord knows, you know, as Eileen said, the documentation wasn't all there. And so they put everything they could find in a box. You've got record storage cartons, and you open every box as a journey. You open a box and you might find a sputum cup used for TB patients to spit into. You might find a pair of fur gloves. You might find photographs, newspaper, whatever. As long as it was in a box, that was what they did. And they made an inventory with the basic information. What is it? Where did it come from? If we know, what condition is it in, things like that. So that's where I came in. That was a great resource, both the preservation plan assessment and that inventory, but boy, it was not searchable. And there was a lot going on. And so I just wanted to show you some even more scary before pictures, just so you don't go forward just yet. Just so you know that it gets worse before it gets better. This was us trying to condense boxes, to remove newspapers from snuggling with photographs, you know, trying to get more information about the things in the boxes. For example, I might open a box that on the inventory sheet says it's found in collection. And because so many of those inventory sheets were done by awesome, but, you know, not professionally trained volunteers, we had one particular volunteer, I guess, who thought found in collection meant that they personally found it in the collection just then. And so I might open the box and be like expecting a mystery item, and instead there's a deed of gift wrapped around it. So we first went through and updated as much stuff as we could so that we could get a better handle on the types of materials in the collection, the sources and things like that. So here's the gets worse. We've made many messes. And a lot of that we, of course, is just me. I have a tendency to use the royal we, but oftentimes it was just me. So now you can go to the next slide, please. So we took, I took the preservation assessment and used it to evaluate the process that had progress that had happened so far. So like I said, that inventory, there were things like deeds of gift for things that had come in, even if they hadn't been accessioned or weren't necessarily appropriate for the collection in the long run. At least we had paperwork. So a lot of those like initial on the ground steps came from Eileen and were really helpful to keep it from getting worse. Before it got worse. We've also used it to do lots of stuff with the collection in terms of acquiring funding, acquiring expertise and planning. So one of the things that we've done, for example, is expand our collection storage. This picture here is our upper attic space, which still looks like a murder attic, but at least it's more space to let us lay out our flat materials flat and not stack things on top of each other and things like that. So anyway, so we took preservation assessment recommendations and used it to show the progress that we've been making in order to apply for more funding. And one of the first things, as Eileen mentioned, I got the date wrong. I finished it in 2018. We applied in 2017. Who knows? But I made a collections preservation plan. This is my trusty, dusty binder. It's not dusty. But this helped take the steps that had been recommended in our original assessment and recognize the progress we had made and chart going forward what priorities had changed or what resources were available now that we didn't have back then, things like that. Then we have also used the Eileen's assessment and this preservation plan to apply for image cataloging funding, record transcription funding for TB patient records, which is a huge and unique research request that we deal with, image digitization and a collections assistant. who's standing over there, and also creating an online collections database with some funding. We are also preparing to move the entire collection. So you have your sort of ability to work with what you've got is great. There are small things that you can do, but sometimes fate has a way of forcing your hand for the good. And so we're expanding the museum, and in the new museum space, we get an entire collections wing with a reading room that we're sort of not designing from the ground up, but rehabbing to our specifications. And so again, the things that we identified in that original assessment and the preservation plan tell us, for sure, like, don't house your collection in an uninsulated attic. That gets to be 95 degrees. Sometimes you can't do anything about that, but sometimes you can take small steps, like we put up reflective insulation over the windows to deflect the sun out of our collection storage, for example. So there are small things. But anyway, we are preparing to do cataloging, rehousing, things like that, so that we aren't moving things that we don't want to move, and we aren't moving things twice. So there have been lots of offshoots, and I'll talk about a few sort of lessons, I guess, that I distilled out of all of this experience thus far on the next slide. Oh, not this one. Okay, so I forgot about this. No, you're good. You're good. So first of all, it looks scary. Everyone's scary basement or attic collection is kind of overwhelming. You're not alone in that. And progress is incremental. So this one on the left was taken earlier in the year at some point. And it looks like a mishmash. It doesn't look that different from some of the after photos that Eileen had, but the photo on the right, which I actually took this morning, shows that we actually have collections items accessioned in boxes with labels. The folders are in order, things are in folders, etc. And so, we still have lots of these inventory boxes that we're slowly working our way through, but progress is growing around the room, and we've had to keep shuffling things in order to make space for our accessioned items boxes, which is really very satisfying. So, it doesn't have to look fancy, the before and after, but it can be incredibly satisfying anyway. All right, now the next slide. So, where's my lessons? Can you click again? Oh, oops. Okay, so it's animated, I guess, accidentally. So my first thing that I will say to you after your assessment and during the process, actually, is to document as much as you can. Whether it's taking notes about things that you think might be priorities or problems, things that you have questions about and you need outside expertise on, or even a decision that you made. If you said all photographs are going to get housed in these drawers, write that down. You can never have too many notes to yourself and to future use, to your collections committee, things like that. So documentation. You can just click a bunch of times and maybe everything will come up. So you want to set standards for regular processes, whether that's box numbering or how you write folder titles, or even what kinds of gloves you wear, when handling photographs, and no, you don't need gloves when handling everything, things like that. Because do not assume that you will remember, and do not assume that you will be around to remember. You never know, you might leave a position, might get run over by a bus, you might get an assistant who has to help you, etc. So it's always important to write stuff down. Leave yourself space to work is a really important lesson that I've learned from this process. I know we're all sort of cramped in places, but don't assume that once you put things in a box, that's it forever. you know, things might need to change. Start with low-hanging fruit, as Eileen mentioned, and I think Erica too. That'll be one of the recommendations in your assessment, and that might be things like stop having photographs in the same folder with newspaper, or you know, put labels on your boxes. Things that feel like you don't have to get into the entire collection to do. That sense of accomplishment is really important when you're starting anything like this. And so if you can check some things off your list, like almost immediately, that really helps propel you forward. All right. I think I have one or two more. Striving for perfection can cause you problems in the meantime. If you look at your collection, you say like, I need to do this huge overhaul, and so I can't start it. You might find yourself missing an item in your collection that really needs help, or dragging your feet on projects because you feel like it has to be perfect. So there's always, you know, incremental change and improvements available. Okay, next one. Make sure to talk to your staff, your fellow staff members, even if they're not collections people, your volunteers and your board members, about what you're doing. Eileen mentioned, you know, buy-in. And if they think you're just up in the attic, you know, sorting through dusty papers, it'll be hard to make the case for funding for projects. And, you know, they might start to think the collections are just as cool as you do. So next one. And the last, of course, this is what I always say about our collections, but the saying of how do you eat an elephant, which is one bite at a time. You're only one person, or, you know, a part-time person, or, and so, you know, thinking about those small bites that you can do, again, that feels very good, and gets you suddenly much further than you realize. So, and there I am looking very calm and having my entire collection in order, obviously. So I think that's all of my lessons. Yeah. So are there any questions now for me or others? And I'm also like always happy to talk to people about various projects that we've done, because, you know, I would not have finished all the work that we have in the last 8.5 years without the expertise of others in the field and in the community. And Eileen has been an awesome partner in a whole bunch of grant projects. So, you know, you will make friends with your consultants for sure.
Thank you, Jessie. So we have one more section of slides, and there will certainly be another opportunity to ask questions after that. So I'm going to proceed at this point with the last segment of our prepared content for you. And so now the question that may be at the forefront of your mind after hearing us talk about assessments and hiring assessors to come in and look at your collection is, how do you pay for it? So there are a number of different ways that you can go about finding funding. And some of them may be more workable to you depending on the size of your organization and your bandwidth and capacity for applying for grants versus looking for other opportunities. And also what you have in mind for a project. So some of these sources may be better suited for a larger general preservation assessment overview, and some of them may be better suited for a more targeted, specific assessment of a certain aspect of your collection. So up on the screen in front of you, there are a bunch of different things to keep in mind and look for. you may actually be able to get a trustee or another contact in your community to pay for an assessment project. So depending on the size and the scope of work, this could be a reasonable ask for a private donation. There are also a bunch of potential funding sources on the state level, depending on how things are structured in your particular state. So it may be worth a call to arts councils or library associations, historical records advisory boards, and humanities councils is another great example. And so all of these places may either have a pot of money themselves, or they may know who else to turn to. And they may also have connections with some assessors in your geographic region as well. So typically things on the state level are going to be maybe offered on an annual basis for a grant opportunity. So you'll have to find out when that timing happens and plan accordingly. But the application process is often a little bit less involved than applying for something like a federal grant. Some states actually have free programs or very, very low cost programs available to you. So I just want to highlight a couple examples. One program that Eileen actually manages for the Vermont Historical Society is a mentorship program offered through the League of Local Historical Societies and Museums to organizations that are located in the state of Vermont. So her program will will match you up with a mentor, assessor, who could come in and spend a few hours in person on site. So if you have a small project and you're within the state of Vermont, definitely seek out Eileen after this webinar and see whether the mentorship program is the right opportunity for you. Rachel, who's also on this call today, manages the Roving Archivist program through the Vermont Historical Records program. So if you're in Vermont, again, it might be a great opportunity to connect with her. I understand that many of her services or those of her staff are offered for free. And she may also have a lead on, if you're not in Vermont, where the other comparable programs are located. There are also a bunch of grants from nonprofit affinity groups. A couple that come to mind is there's a small grant that consulting fees are one qualifying expense that's offered by the Costume Society of America. So if you have a project in mind that's a specific assessment of textile collections, that could be a good opportunity. So check that out. And I should have mentioned earlier that we do have a resource handout that will be going out to all of you by email with some more detail in terms of both possible funding sources and also some general references for you as well after this webinar. Another nonprofit affinity group that offers grants for assessment is Conservation Connection. So if you are in the state of Connecticut, definitely look them up. Their information, the webpage is linked out to on this resource handout that will be coming to you. And certainly federal grants. So Chessie mentioned IMLS. And also, I think Eileen, it was you who mentioned the NEH PAG grant. So those are two federal opportunities. There are several others. Some of you may have heard of a program called CAP, Conservation Assistance Program. That is one specifically geared towards assessments. And some of these programs that are offered by federal programs are low cost if you qualify, or even no cost, and some require a one-to-one match. So you'll have to look at the fine print. But keep in mind, for any federal program, you'll need to complete some introductory paperwork, get registered with grants.gov, and also be prepared for a long lead time. So typically their funding cycles happen once a year, and then it takes 6-9 months, even sometimes, to get notified if you have received funding. And then after that point, you'll be able to get in touch with your assessor and actually schedule the assessment itself. A lot of these federal programs have a bank of assessors already identified, so they can help with the matching process as well. All right, so I think that that is my wrap up for funding sources. And so now is the time to stop the share and open the floor up for any additional questions that you may have. I'd love to hear from you.
I have a question.
Hi, Teresa.
Hi. So I'm located in Swickley, Pennsylvania. It's a suburb of Pittsburgh. Swickley, the borough of Swickley, it's a certified local government. Does that help with any of these funding sources? If you're familiar with the CLG program, and I don't know if any of the presenters are today, but do you think that helps with sort of, you know, in the application process of these funding programs?
I don't specifically myself have expertise in that area, but I'm going to turn it over to maybe Eileen or Rachel to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of say as well, I don't have any specific information I don't know that it helps specifically with the programs that we sort of have listed, but I do know obviously there are grant programs specifically for CLG, depending on the state. I think that you could tap into that other places couldn't tap into. So I think it's worth taking a look at what some of those might be that are different for you that you might have access to.
Hi, Teresa. I would just add that you could be in touch with the CCAHA in Philadelphia and ask them what they might know about resources for funding for assessments.
I have another question. So I'm also on the board of Swickley Valley Historical Society, and we have a decent collection of archives and objects. And I am familiar with CAP assessments, but I'm curious, when I reached out to them, well, sorry, let me back up a little bit. We are very similar, I think, to one of the examples where we are a tenant in a historical, like a registered building, a landmark building. We share it with Sweetwater Center for the Arts. And so, for example, the CAP assessment would only deal with our little area of this building, I believe, and not the entire building. And so it seems like there might be some hurdles, I guess, as being a tenant and not being like our own standalone sort of entity. Am I right? Am I wrong? I don't know. Do you have any feedback on that?
Well, regardless of your tenant status, or if your organization owns property or is renting space, any good assessment will look at the space that you're in and your circumstances where you're at and take those into consideration. So there are some basic aspects of an assessment project that would apply irregardless of whether you own the building that you're located in or not. And certainly renting space is very common. And so I would think that assessors would not blink twice at that. What might come into play here, however, if it's a historic structure that you don't own, an assessment, if you're looking for federal funding or, well, I guess any external funding, they're going to want to put their money into a project where they're looking specifically at the assets that the receiving organization owns. So their collections, and if you're thinking about the historic building along the framework of historic preservation, or even thinking about it as another collection item, if you don't own that historic structure, that's where it might get sticky in terms of getting funding for that assessment. Which isn't to say that the owner of that building could not get funding for an assessment of it.
So potentially the owner of the building, which is also a nonprofit, could be the applicant for some of these funding sources to get these assessments specifically for the Sewickley Valley Historical Society. You think?
The owner of the structure would be best placed to seek out funding for an assessment of that structure itself.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Whereas you, as the holder of the collections, would be best placed to seek out the funding for an assessment focused on the collections. So there may be aspects of that assessment that take into consideration the environmental conditions of that historic structure, but they wouldn't necessarily look at the historic preservation of that structure itself. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
I'd also like to add into the federal list to also look at state organizations that might be able to financially assist with grants, as well as banks, depending upon who your historical society uses as its financial institution, and others that might be in your area. It would pay to give them a call and see if they do grants for small cultural organizations. There are a few that do and pride themselves on that, but you have to ask those questions because it's not always immediately advertised. So that could be a source for some small funding, but sometimes that small funding gets you over a hump or gets you into starting something that then you can blossom into going for state or federal funding as well. And Erica, I think we had a question in the chat from Diana, if you'd like to take on.
Sure. Diana asks about how institutions can best prepare for an assessment. What do you need to do to prepare for the visit, and what kind of information or documentation should you provide to the assessor? So I'll start us off, and then I'll pass it over to Eileen to certainly add more. And Chessie, you may also have some input on this, having been in the position of preparing material. So first of all, I would say, don't worry about addressing your unfinished projects before your assessor arrives on the scene. Don't feel bad or ashamed of whatever condition you're dealing with, because it's really important to be honest. And also you might actually benefit from that assessor's recommendations rather than jumping into a project that you have in mind that you haven't had a chance to talk over with the assessor. But certainly any kind of background information about your organization will be super helpful. So mission statement, a little sketch of the organizational structure, organizational history, briefly will be super helpful. Knowing providing information to the assessor about who the stakeholders are. Who do you think is the audience for this report? Besides yourself, presumably the person who's dealing with the collections on the day-to-day. Do you want this to be able to present this report to your board of trustees, for example? Do you have a grant project already in mind? So you are wanting to make sure that the assessor addresses something that you think you might be applying for funding for example. Also, any kind of data that you can supply. Do you have an inventory on hand? Do you have environmental data? Do you have even a sense of how many boxes you might have, even if you don't have a specific number of the various kinds of collections that you have in hand? Certainly that will go a long way. And also it's really important to think about what your priorities are. So what are your burning questions? What are the things that you know you want to address? Are you concerned about anything? What do you want the assessor to know about what you've already done, what you've already accomplished? That should be mentioned and applauded in that report. So Eileen, what can you add?
Yeah, I mean, I think going off of that, I think, you know, what are the questions you have and what are the answers that you need? You know, like if you can have both of those ready to go, that will really, I think, really help to guide both you and the assessor in what you're doing. And again, information or documentation, I think you can't almost have too much to, you know, to give to somebody. So as Eric was saying, you know, this is somebody who's coming in and they're kind of relying on you to provide the context to be able to make good recommendations. So however much context you can give them, you know, the better off those recommendations are going to be as far as how they line up with who you are as an organization and what you need and what you can accomplish. So, you know, and again, I think, you know, sort of reiterating Erica's, and I think the point before of don't feel that you have to either, even as a point of fact, over prepare anything for it. Like, feel free to be warts and all. Like that's, you know, that's what, you know, what I think assessors are kind of expecting and want to see, and then can work from there.
I think I have one thing is like being physically ready for the assessor. Like, do you have a spot where you can both sit down? You know, can you get into your spaces? Like, are they unlocked? Are the lights all burnt out? Whatever. Like, I know you're not supposed to like clean house before they come, but like if you find yourself scrambling around the day of, like, that's frustrating for you and for them. And so just taking like a quick minute to think about that stuff, I think is really helpful. And that's true for any, you know, person coming into your collection. But
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, a lot of, you know, collections may be located in a site that's better accessed at certain times of the year, right? Maybe it's because the volunteers are there in the summer months, but many of them are snowbirds. And so the best time to host your assessor is when everyone's around. It could also be that some of your collections are in an unheated space. And so that may be less practical to have an assessment occur during that time of the year, but also important for the assessor to know, however, that space is unheated and less accessible at certain times of the year.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question. And I guess maybe it's for Eileen, because I'm actually a paintings conservator. So I'm thinking in the perspective of being the assessor. And, you know, it seems like you've had really good relationships with the organizations that you've worked with. And I wondered if you had an example of one where you didn't feel it worked as well, because I'm thinking back to a time, it was actually probably 10 years ago now. It was a CAP assessment that an objects conservator colleague of mine was working on. And she had me come because in addition to furniture and decorative arts, they had paintings. And then it was also assessing the building, which I had some knowledge of because I have a background in historic preservation, and then landscaping. But for us, it was kind of a challenging project in that the person giving us the tour, the walkthrough, I believe he was probably the director, but he spent a lot of time talking about the conservation work that they had done on like ceramic objects and paintings where the objects had been reglazed and refired, you know, glued together, reglazed and refired. So it's not like a level of work that my colleague would have recommended. And then again, with paintings, like tears were repaired with what looked like blobs of like toilet paper. So he was very proud of what they had already done, but at the same time, we were trying to provide, you know, this is one approach, but for us, you know, the standards are a little bit different. And I feel like it was maybe in a way just a misunderstanding of expectations. And I wasn't the primary on it. And I know that she did follow up with a very thorough document and followed up a few times, but that she didn't feel that it was like a productive
Hmm.
process in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I think that that's sort of a good example. I would say for myself, one of the other ones that's always challenging is when you have what I might call dueling factions.
Okay.
So people within the organization who are sort of, they're not all on the same page, and that can
Yeah.
be difficult to sort of walk into the middle of and
Yeah.
to sort of know who is it that you're sort of focusing on, or how you're doing that. And again, I think that's where it becomes sort of that non-judgmental kind of action where, again, you're taking in the information, not making a judgment on it per se. And I think, I do love that idea of then proactively, again, providing some validation of, hey, we know you've done work to try to improve your collections, but in the future, this is what we would recommend,
Yeah.
based on our experience and our level of expertise going forward for how you would treat paintings, or how you might treat your collections, and that sort of thing. So yeah, and I think sort of coming back around to then also really thinking about, who and how are you helping, and that again, if the person who's sort of doing all the talking is not necessarily a person that's working in the collections, sort of weeding through that and saying, how do I help the people who are actually on the ground in the collections as much as I can, and trying to focus on them.
Yeah. No, I wanted also to say I really appreciated how you started your portion of the presentation with all those, qualities for doing, because it just very spoke to me with that particular project.
Yeah, and again, I think this is sort of from both ends, and my
Yeah.
experience, obviously, over the years is mostly with smaller organizations, so people who tend to not have professional staff. And again, I think this is one of those things where we all have to remember, even from working, at the Smithsonian, knowing like even that place didn't have enough money or enough people, or, the joke was we couldn't lend to ourselves because we're not, we don't have good enough storage. So, like sort of knowing that we can all work towards attainable goals no matter our size.
Yeah, it was interesting as well because, I mean, it was a smaller organization, but it was also an organization that had, board members who were willing to provide significant funding. I mean, we're talking Los Angeles. So, so it was like, but it was almost like it was done in the sense like, oh, I have someone repair my ceramics, so let's just send it to this person. And it's like, well, it's a different level of repair,
Yep.
It was interesting. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I think one of the undercurring themes that I keep hearing through all three presentations and the questions that have ensued are a few points that stand out to help us and guide us through these assessments. One of them is to be consistent. As Chessie had said, be consistent in how you're doing things, because you're not going to necessarily remember. And you may lose your job, or you may not be able to get back to that project because you're the only one doing everything. Take small bites, because that's the best way to assess and have success at doing something, and that challenge of getting something done and then realizing the satisfaction. And as Eileen said, understand it's all going to take time. You might not get something done in 6 months. You might not get something done in 8 years, but at least you're getting some kind of progress and you know that things are happening. Be patient. Realize that you're not alone in your challenge. Any historical society or museum or any kind of collecting venue that is going through an assessment is doing the same type of thing. Reach out to your colleagues and ask questions of them if they're experiencing the same type of assessments or preparing for them or have already gone through them, and then share your successes, because then all of you can feel really good about the satisfaction of achieving your goals and knowing that you're doing right for your institutions and most importantly for the collections. Do we have any other questions for our panelists this afternoon? Okay, well, I certainly want to thank Erica, Eileen and Chessie for their presentations today. Very informative. And I hope that those of you who have joined us, if you came with questions or if you came needing clarifications of things, that we have been successful in achieving a resolution for you. I'll just remind you to join us next Tuesday for Conversations with Colleagues, which will be from 12 noon to 1 p.m. And again, the link to that will be included with the recording for today's presentation. And if you have ideas of future presentations, webinars, workshops that you might like us to consider putting together for you, please let us know by emailing the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, because we'd love to hear from you. We want to make sure that our topics that we pull together and offer as webinars and workshops are meeting the target of things that you need. So please be sure to be in touch. And if there are no further questions or comments, I just want to say thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, everybody. Take care.